Thank you. I heard a little sense of disparagement from my athletic career there, just a little bit. You know, I learned in Israel that the quickest way to becoming a great Jewish athlete, play with Jews. I was Division II quality here. I came to Israel, and right now you're looking at a member of the Israeli Football Hall of Fame. It is really a pleasure to be here in Memphis, and this is unbelievable Southern hospitality, I have to tell you. I don't know if it's officially called in Memphis Southern hospitality, but this is terrific ever since I arrived. I suppose I should call this the city of kings, and I experienced that twice today. First, I went to the Holy of Holies in Memphis in Graceland. I told the people there that I come from a land filled with grace, so it's only natural that I should go to Graceland. And then from there, I went to this fabulous, wonderful civil rights museum that you have, a place where another great king and someone I have admired my entire life fell. And it's a wonderful museum and a wonderful city, and I'm so honored to be here. And Mr. Mayor, I'm deeply honored that you've taken the time to be here today. You should know, and I told you a little bit about it before, I didn't tell you the whole story. I have a real soft spot for mayors. And it's not just because my father was mayor of Miami Beach. And it's not just because my brother was mayor of Miami Beach. As you mentioned, my father passed away soon before my bar mitzvah. So I have an older brother and older sister. And my older brother wanted to name, he had a firstborn son, and he wanted to name him after my father. And so he named him Yaakov. He had named him Jay, which was my father's English name. My sister then had a firstborn son a few years later, and she wanted to name her firstborn son after our father. So she called him Jacob, Yaakov. That was my father's Hebrew name. So I was stuck. They took the English name. They took the Hebrew name. So what is a guy going to do when he has a firstborn son? But I remember when I was walking around Miami Beach with my father as a boy, everyone who saw him said, "Hey, Mayor Dermer, Mayor Dermer." So our son is named Mayor J. Dermer. He is Mayor Dermer. And it's spelled M-A-Y-O-R. I am not making this up. And at his bris, I asked my mother, is it better to be the wife of a mayor, the mother of a mayor, or the grandmother of a mayor? But I want to thank you very much for coming here. And I want to thank you also, Rabbi Finkelstein, for your very apt remarks. And for the reception here at this really wonderful congregation and Jewish community partners who've put this event together. Tonight, I know you're going to have an opportunity to ask questions. You can ask me anything you want. I'll try to avoid them the best way I can. I'm a diplomat. That's what we do. But I want to talk to you a little bit about the situation that we're facing in Israel. And the last few months have been hard. You have had a series of stabbings, of car rammings, of shootings in Israel over the last 6 months or so that have claimed the lives of 30 of our citizens and have wounded, many of them seriously, over 350. And some of these have been terrible tragedies. You may remember the story of the Henkin family who was driving in their car and they were murdered with their children in the back. There was a mother of 6 who was recently murdered in her home. And just on Thursday, we had a 21-year-old new father who was murdered in a supermarket. So we have faced very difficult times for the last few months, but I can assure you that Israel will overcome these challenges. We faced them before in the past, and we'll continue to overcome it, and we are. Every day, while these attacks are happening, we have succeeded in stopping many of them. All the tragedies that I spoke about, that I mentioned, those are the ones that we didn't stop. But we have stopped so many because we have a very brave and resilient people, very good security services, and a very brave and resilient people. Some of you may have heard the story of Hadar Cohen, this 19-year-old woman who's new to our border guards. A few weeks ago, she was outside the old city, which many of you have probably visited. Maybe you've gone through that gate, Damascus Gate. She and one of her fellow guards saw a couple of suspicious-looking people and went over to them. And because she went over to them, they took out a knife, one took out a gun, and she was killed. But they had in their bag automatic rifles, and they were going to perpetrate a massive terror attack. And because of her bravery, she saved many, many lives. And you have seen this bravery in Israel day after day, week after week, month after month throughout the country. So we're a very, very, very powerful and a resilient people in Israel. So we're going to overcome it. I'm not worried about Israel. But I am worried about what I see happening in the world and how people are treating Israel. It's important to understand why these attacks are happening. These attacks are happening because of rampant incitement, a culture of hatred that is being inculcated day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. And sometimes it boils over. You saw it happen at the beginning a few months ago with this lie that Israel was trying to destroy the mosque on the Temple Mount. And then that lie was changed into another lie. We were summarily executing a lot of these Palestinian terrorists. We were just executing them. The story that Palestinians are told is a very different story than you see on your television screens. The story they're told is that these were people, innocent people walking around, and all of a sudden Israelis just decided to shoot them. Not that they were lunging at a soldier or a police officer or a 13-year-old boy or an 82-year-old grandmother. They tell them a very different story. And this incitement is not just happening, is not just being pushed by Hamas, a terror organization that is committed to Israel's destruction. It is also being pushed by the Palestinian Authority, which should be our partners in peace. The world considers them our partners in peace, but they are pushing it. The leader of the Palestinian Authority said, "We welcome every single drop of blood spilled in Jerusalem." This was not said by the leader of Hamas. It was not said by the leader of Iran. It was said by President Abbas, the leader of the Palestinians. Now, part of the problem we have in dealing with this situation that we face is we have an international community that, by and large, is devoid of any kind of moral clarity. We have a laziness, an intellectual laziness, when they're dealing with Israel and how they speak and how they think about the problem. And so you've heard it many times. What you hear is they say, well, both sides need to work to restore calm. We've got to stop this cycle of violence, a cycle of violence. We've got people, day after day, who are trying to kill our citizens. And then we have security forces who are trying to protect citizens. That's not a cycle of violence, but that's what you hear. And you have these statements that we have to deal with the extremists on all sides, as if there's some moral equivalence between our extremists and their extremists. Israel has extremists. It happens from time to time. It happened last year when in Duma, in a Palestinian area, a Molotov cocktail was thrown into a home, and it killed a family, including a child. We saw it a couple of years ago when an innocent Arab boy was kidnapped, and he was horribly burned to death. That happens. But you do not judge a society by the action of the extremists. You judge it based on the reaction of the society to that act of extremism. And what happened when those acts occurred? Wall-to-wall condemnation across Israel. Prime Minister of Israel, the President of Israel, the heads of all the major parties, the religious leaders in the society. Go Google it and find me 5 people in Israel who praised that action. Every single leader condemns it. And not only did they condemn it, the Prime Minister of the State of Israel went to the hospital to visit the family in Duma who was attacked. The Prime Minister of Israel went to the hospital. And Israelis were overcome by a sense of revulsion and embarrassment with these actions. Now, what happened on the other side? What happens when there are these acts of extremism? You think you saw President Abbas visiting the wounded in Israel in the hospital? No. He visits the families of the terrorists. They call them martyrs. They glorify them. They celebrate them. They name public squares after these killers. And if they don't die in perpetrating their crimes, if they sit in a prison, they pay them. And they pay their families a lot of money. More money, the more people they've killed. That's what happens within Palestinian society. When you have a society that's being poisoned, that glorifies killers day after day, do not be surprised to see 13 and 15 and 17-year-old kids grab knives and kill people. Now, the question people are asking is, when is this going to end? When are we going to put a stop to it? When is the terrorism going to end? When is the conflict going to finally end? And my answer to you is, in order to solve a problem, you actually have to diagnose it. It helps. When someone has cancer, God forbid, an aspirin doesn't solve the problem. And if somebody has a headache, don't give them chemotherapy. So the first thing you have to understand is, what is the problem? And here, what we have is more confusion than clarity. Confusion over the root cause of our conflict with the Palestinians. Confusion over the root cause of terrorism. And the biggest confusion is that those two things are connected, and they're not. And I want to spend a few minutes, because I think it's so important to add a little clarity to this discussion. I want to spend a few minutes speaking about that. First, our conflict with the Palestinians. There's a lot of other things going around in the Middle East, a lot of other problems, but I want to speak specifically a few minutes about our conflict with the Palestinians. If you ask most people why Israel has a conflict with the Palestinians, what they will tell you, and these are educated people, serious people, they will tell you it's because Israel controls territories that it won in the Six-Day War. On June 4th, 1967, those territories were because Israel's building in the settlements. It's a wonderful theory. Here's the problem. The conflict with the Palestinians has been going on for 50 years before June 4th, 1967. The whole world tells Israel, go back to the June 4th, 1967 lines and you'll get peace. Well, guess what? Those were not lines of peace. Those were lines of war. We had 50 years of violence between Israelis and Palestinians before June 4th, 1967. And when Israel went back to that line, does exactly what the international community says. Go back to that June 4th, 67 line, uproot all those settlements, and you'll get peace. Well, we did that. Exhibit A, Gaza. And what did we get? We didn't get peace. We got thousands of rockets on our cities, about 20,000 rockets fired at Israel from Gaza. And they weren't doing it to liberate the West Bank. They said they were doing it to liberate Haifa and Akko and Tel Aviv. To deal with this conflict, we have to start speaking the truth. We have to address and puncture what is essentially a culture of lies. If we don't start dealing with this culture of lies, we will never be able to advance to peace. And the greatest lie that you have, the lie that is preventing us resolving our conflict with the Palestinians, is that the Jewish people are colonialists in the land of Israel. Palestinians walk around believing a narrative that Israel, for the Jewish people, is like India for the British, or Algeria for the French, or the Congo for the Belgians. That's what they think. Now, I don't know, I'm not a historian, but I don't know if the British prayed 3 times a day to Delhi. I don't think so. I don't think the patriarchs of the French people are buried in Algiers. The land of Israel is the place where the patriarchs of the Jewish people prayed, where our prophets preached, and where our kings ruled. In the land of Israel, the Jewish people are not foreign colonialists. In the land of Israel, the Jewish people are home. Are home. Now, if we were in Uganda, as was suggested, that the Jews who were desperate to find a refuge in the late 19th century, Theodor Herzl, the great founder of modern Zionism, said, why don't we take Uganda and settle it? Because he was so concerned of the fate of the Jewish people in Europe. Had the Jewish people been in Uganda, then we would have been a colonialist power. Then all the lies that are said about the Jewish people would be right. But we're not in Uganda. We're in Israel. And the only way that you're going to get a settlement of our conflict is when there is a recognition that the Jewish people are in this land by right. Not by sufferance, but by right. Because the only peace that will hold long term is a peace that is based on a sense of justice. And the Palestinians don't have that sense of justice. Because day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, they are told a very different story. Now, I'll tell you a story, a true story. A couple years ago, the envoy for peace in the United States met with me in Jerusalem. And he came to speak to me. This was in September 2013. I had just been appointed Israel's ambassador. I hadn't come here. And the United States was trying another effort to help the parties advance peace. And we were looking at a speech at the United Nations in 2 or 3 weeks. And the American peace envoy came and spoke to me, and he spoke to a Palestinian on the other side because he thought we would have a hand in the speeches that would be written at the United Nations of the 2 leaders. And what he wanted to do was to ensure that these speeches would not end up pulling the sides apart, but would actually bring the sides together and enable them to continue with their peace talks. I think it's a worthy endeavor. So I met the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. And he tried to do something very wise. He said, I want you to tell me what you want President Abbas to say. in his speech. And I'll tell you what they want Prime Minister Netanyahu to say in his speech. And this is what he tried to do. I thought it was a good idea. So he asked me, what did I want to have President Abbas say? And I'll tell you what I told him. I said, I know that President Abbas is not going to recognize Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. He's not going to do that at a UN speech. He hasn't done it for years. He's not going to do it now. He'll have to do it if he wants us to sign a peace agreement and make the concessions he wants us to make. But I know it's not going to happen now. But I want him to do two things before that. I want President Abbas to say that the Jews are not only a faith, but we are a people. Faiths have no right of self-determination. Peoples do. The Jews are a people. Peoples have rights of self-determination. One. Number two is I want President Abbas to talk in some way about the connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. Historical facts. The year before he was at the UN and he talked about the connection of Christians and Muslims to Jerusalem. And yes, there's a connection. But he forgot about that other people. 1,000 years before the birth of Jesus, 1,500 years before the birth of Muhammad, King David was ruling in Jerusalem. And the leader of the Palestinians wants to wipe away that history. And so I said, talk about the historical connection of the Jewish people to this land. And the peace envoy said to me this, well, I think that's doable. I'm not making this up. And I said, I disagree. It's not doable. And what concerns me is that you think it's doable. You don't understand the ideological core of this conflict. When that is doable, we will have peace in a matter of weeks. We won't need special envoys. Because when the Palestinians admit that the Jews are a people and that we have a connection to that land, that means that we're there by right. And they refuse to admit it. Without a recognition of Israel as a Jewish state, without a recognition of our rights in that land, until that narrative among the Palestinians changes, you have no chance to get to peace. That is my firm belief. People don't want to force other people to confront a narrative? Yes. When someone believes the earth is flat, you must force him to confront a narrative that they disagree with. And when they recognize that we have a connection to the place, that's not going to be all that they need to do. We also have to have security arrangements on the ground that will ensure that this peace can hold. A leader has to cross a Rubicon. There's no doubt about it. That's the necessary but not sufficient condition. But we only have one Jewish state, and we have to make sure that that state is protected. It's not just words. We need to be able to have a state that we can defend and a peace that we can defend. That's the first thing about our conflict. Well, what about the root cause of terrorism? Root cause of the conflict is the refusal of the Palestinians to recognize a Jewish state in any boundary. That is the root cause of the conflict. That's what it was 67 years ago. That's what it was before the state of Israel was established, and that's what it is now. Don't be confused. But what about the terrorism? And if people are wrong about the root cause of the conflict, they are clueless about the root cause of terrorism. What do most people, when you click on the television, what do most people say is the reason why these terrorist attacks are happening? What do they say? Settlements? Yeah, maybe some. People say it's poverty. It's desperation. Hopelessness. Despair. No political process. Deprivation of rights. Occupation, quote unquote. These are the reasons why they're resorting to terrorism. All right, let's try to unpack that for a second. Is poverty the reason why people resort to terrorism? Poverty. Okay. Bin Laden, was he poor? No? 15 hijackers, 9/11. You remember them online at the soup kitchens? No? Okay. San Bernardino, were those people poor? Were they in a homeless shelter before they committed their acts? No? Bangladesh, Haiti, two of the poorest countries in the world. Raise your hand if you know of a Haitian terrorist. Bangladeshi terrorist. Anyone? No. Maybe poverty doesn't have anything to do with it whatsoever. In fact, people who bother to look at the facts, they will find that terrorists tend to be wealthier and better educated than their immediate surroundings. That's a fact. But if you repeat it ad nauseum that it's because of poverty, maybe people will believe it. Well, what about this sense that there's no political process? Right? They don't see the state. They want a Palestinian state, and if only they would have a political process, then they wouldn't perpetrate these acts. Well, you remember 20 years ago when buses were blowing up, when the peace process was racing ahead? You remember that? Peace was just around the corner, and then we were told the reason why the buses were blowing up is here are the enemies of peace. Now we're told that the reason why they're killing people is because they don't have a political process. Then it was because the political process was racing ahead. We had terrorism when there was no political process. We've had terrorism when there was a political process. It has nothing to do with it. Well, what about this argument that it's the occupation? It's the result of a grievance that they have. Right? Occupation. In fact, I heard Ban Ki-moon. Ban Ki-moon is the Secretary General of the United Nations. And 2 weeks ago, he said that it is natural, and I quote, it is natural for people to respond to occupation in this way. Really? It's natural? Do you know that Turkey has occupied Cyprus for over 40 years? How many Cypriot terrorists do you know of? If it's natural, why don't we see all these Cypriots stabbing and running over Turks on Cyprus or in Turkey? Britain occupied India for a very, very long time. Why did Gandhi not send people over to London to blow up buses if it's natural? This idea that there's a grievance and the grievance justifies terrorism is unbelievably wrong, and it's said all the time. Did Martin Luther King have a legitimate grievance? You bet he did. Did he resort to terrorism, to the deliberate murder of the innocent? Never. Because he was a Democrat, not a terrorist. The root cause of terrorism is a totalitarian mindset. If you want to understand how that mindset is forged, read a very small book written about 65 years ago by a man named Eric Hoffer called The True Believer. It's my homework assignment for today. It's all of about 100 pages, and he will tell you, and he studied the phenomena, what makes people drawn to mass movements. And what you find there is that it is not despair at all, but fervent hope. The hope that you're going to achieve your goal. The hope that you're going to be able to fulfill your totalitarian vision. And when you combine that hope with the poisoning of minds, over and over and over again, you can have a pretty combustible combination. And what we have in Palestinian society, through media, through schools, through mosques, is the drumming in of this hatred, day after day, week after week, month after month. When you live in a society where the people who are respected, the people who are called heroes are the firefighters and policemen, young people will want to be firefighters and policemen. If you live in a community where the people who are respected is a great scholar, a rabbinical scholar, young people will want to be rabbinical scholars. When you live in a society where your heroes are terrorists, where those who murdered Jews, town squares are named after them, then young people will want to be terrorists. And that's what we're facing, and the problem is worse because we're living in a region in the Middle East where you have the forces of militant Islam on the rise. That makes this problem even more dangerous. To stop the terror, ladies and gentlemen, we have to deal with this culture of hate. To end the conflict, we have to deal with this culture of lies. No one wants to talk about it. Everyone wants to sweep it under the rug, but that's how you're going to be able to actually solve this problem. And here, we need the help of the international community. Israel can't do it alone. To stop letting the Palestinians get away with denying basic history. There has to be some standards. You can't just say, as Arafat said at Camp David to President Clinton, there was never a temple on the Temple Mount. You can't just deny the Jewish people's connection to the land. And don't dismiss it, and don't ignore it, and don't say none of this is important. It's the most important thing. And we have to have the international community confront these lies. Whether it's the Temple Mount, the lie that Israel is trying to destroy mosques on the Temple Mount, or the lie that we're trying to execute people like the Swedish foreign minister. This is the foreign minister of Sweden accused Israel of executing Palestinians. How outrageous. And we can't have a situation where the leader of the Palestinians goes to the United Nations and accuses my country of genocide. That's what he did. The head of the Palestinian Authority went to the United Nations and accused the state of Israel of genocide. Do you understand how outrageous that is? Genocide. Does anyone know how many people have been killed in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Anyone? This is single jeopardy. We're a small enough crowd. Anyone? Want to raise their hand? There's a brave soul out there. Yeah. No, I'm saying Israelis and Palestinians, not Israelis and all Arabs, Israelis and Palestinians. In the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has been going on for about a century, since 1920, at an attack on an immigration office in Jaffa, till today, yesterday, how many people have been killed? 4,000? That's a low guess. Well, it's something, by the way, I ask fellow ambassadors. You have these courtesy meetings where you meet other ambassadors. And I always ask them this question: how many people you think have been killed in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And the lowest number I've heard is 250,000. Some people think it's 1 million, think it's 1.5 million. Has to be, right? Because everyone in the world is focused on it. In 100 years, 20,000 people have been killed on both sides. 20,000 people. And the leader of the Palestinians stands at the United Nations and accuses Israel of genocide. Genocide is what happened in Rwanda, when 900,000 people were killed in 3 months. Genocide is what happened in Darfur, when 500,000 people were killed. Genocide is what happened to the Jewish people during the Holocaust, when in May 1944, every single day, 10,000 Jews were murdered at Auschwitz. 10,000 Jews were murdered every day in May 1944. 2 days. What you saw in 100 years of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But when the leader of the Palestinians walks into the United Nations and he accuses Israel of genocide, what we have is the world applauding. That's why you don't have peace. You want to have peace, the world has to not allow that. There are things that a leader should not be allowed to say and be considered, forget about a partner for peace, to be considered a serious person that we're going to meet with. When the world starts treating Palestinian leaders in that way, then maybe you can see a turn of the situation. And if we would focus, the international community would focus a tenth of the time, a 100th of the time that they focus on settlements, on the supposed great crime of Israelis, Jews building apartments in Jerusalem, if they focus 1% of the time on this culture of hatred and lies, then we would be much closer to peace than we are today. Now, I know that those of you looking at the situation in Israel, it sometimes can look pretty bleak. You see this constant strife with the Palestinians, and if you extend the lens there, well, things don't look much better. You've got an implosion, a collapse in the Middle East. You've got a 100-year order that has collapsed in a few years. You've got forces of militant Islam that are rushing to fill the void. A battle that pits Shia radicals led by Iran, which includes Shia militias in Iraq, and Assad regime in Syria, and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Houthis in Yemen. And you have Sunni radicals led by ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Hamas and Boko Haram. One group wants to take us back to the 9th century. One group would like to take us back to the 7th century. Maybe they'll come together to take us back to the 8th century. But if you look around the Horn at Israel, it doesn't seem that good. You've got in Syria, what used to be called Syria, a complete collapse. Iran trying to establish another front, terror front against us. ISIS a few miles from our border. Hezbollah's got 100,000 rockets pointed at Israel, and every day they work to make those rockets more and more dangerous. You have in Gaza, we faced 3 rounds of violence in Gaza. 20,000 rockets, as I said, that had been fired at us. The Sinai has become a Wild West of terror groups. And you see the situation that I spoke about in Judea, Samaria, the West Bank. So it looks pretty bad. Well, before I go, I think it's important because to tell a little different story about what is happening in Israel. Because we Jews have a unique way of seeing the glass as 1/16 empty. And it's not. And there's every reason to be supremely confident about Israel's future. Israel has the strongest army in the Middle East by far. And that army is going to get strong. And we're developing our offensive capabilities and defensive capabilities. We hope we'll be able to reach a new understanding with the United States to even deepen the strategic alliance that we have with the United States. We hope in the weeks ahead we're going to be able to forge an agreement with the administration and to strengthen Israel's military even further. You've seen the defensive weapons that we have, Iron Dome and David Sling and Arrow, that have changed the nature of warfare. And you will see that we will stay one step ahead of these enemies. Israel has a very strong economy. In 1948, the year Israel was established, we had the same GDP per capita as Egypt and Jordan. Today, Israel has a higher GDP per capita than Japan. It's higher than the EU average. And not only is our economy strong, Israel is a global technological power. I don't play a global technological power on TV. Israel is a global technological power. And you have the leading technology companies in the world. They have R&D facilities in Israel. For some of them, it's their only place outside the United States that they have it. And Apple and Cisco and Intel and Microsoft and Google, you name it, The technology company that's serious today has got a place in Israel, and in water, and in agriculture, and in cyber. Israel is leading the world. Here's a statistic that I think is pretty remarkable. Last year, Israel accounted for 20% of the investment in cybersecurity in the world. We're 1/10 of 1% of the world's population, and 20% of the investment in cybersecurity was in Israel. That means we're punching 200 times above our weight. In cyber, Israel's a China. Another reason for optimism is the regional shifts that are happening in the Middle East. It's true that there are great dangers that we face, but we also have opportunities. You have, for the first time since the founding of Israel, where many states in the region understand that we are not their problem, that we are actually an ally. And if you're Saudi Arabia, or if you're United Emirates, let alone Jordan and Egypt, we have peace treaties with, you see Israel as the least of your concerns. You see a strong Israel as being important to your own security because they're concerned with Iran, and Iran that's even more powerful after this agreement. They're concerned with ISIS, other radical groups. So there's enormous possibilities here. And even in Memphis, it's not a place to talk about it publicly. But I will tell you that there are many, many contacts that we have with countries who don't have diplomatic relations with us. A lot of that is happening under the surface, and it should be a source of optimism. Another reason you should be optimistic about Israel is our democracy. Now, I know our democracy is under assault. It's questioned, different campuses, Western Europe. I marvel at Israel's democracy. As somebody born and raised in the United States, I marvel that Israel has been able to uphold its values while being threatened like no country on earth. A democracy is tested in times of war. That's when a democracy is tested. Remember how everyone felt in America on September 12th, 2001. Remember the feeling you had, how you were willing maybe to trade away certain civil liberties to keep your security, and how over time that debate changes. The pendulum shifts. As you get a sense of security, you may be less willing to make those trade-offs. You had an attack in San Bernardino. Remember the public debate that you had about how you should respond to that attack. That was one attack. Israel's had 100 of those. Remember that Israel has been in September 12th for 67 years. And we have kept our democratic values. And Israel should not be embarrassed about its democracy. We should be proud of our democracy. And finally, the reason why we should all be optimistic about Israel's future is that there is an Israel. You know, we take that for granted. We have been given a priceless gift of sovereignty. That we, the Jewish people, have become a sovereign nation again. And we have been given, because of this gift, three things. We've been given a voice, a refuge, and the ability to defend ourselves. The Jewish people used to have to plead with others to make their case. During our darkest hours, we had to beg some junior diplomat of another country to go and speak to somebody on our behalf. Today, a prime minister of a Jewish state can walk into the United Nations and can walk into Congress and can make his case. An ambassador of Israel can go on CNN or the BBC and make his case. We should be very grateful to have recaptured that voice. And today we have a refuge. You know, it used to be as Jews were being expelled from one land after the other, and it happened almost everywhere. It happened in England, it happened in France, happened in Spain, happened in Portugal, happened in different areas in Germany. Jews would lay roots, sometimes for centuries, build wonderful communities, and then boom, they'd have to move on. And they'd have to go to other people to plead with them, to take them into their countries. The Jewish people don't have to do that anymore. You see this rising tide of anti-Semitism in Europe, and people are asking themselves a lot of questions about what's happening there. But you know one question no one's asking? Where are they going to go? And the reason why they're not asking that question is because Israel is an answer. And lastly, the Jewish people used to have to beg kings and presidents to defend them. Today, the Jewish people defend themselves. And our soldiers do it with the courage of the Maccabees of old. Now, I know after this event, I'm going to go and meet with some of the families who have lone soldiers in Israel serving now. I want to ask all of you to stand so we can all thank you. Everyone who has a lone soldier in Israel, I want to ask you to stand so that we can thank you for the service of your family members. They're part of the first army of the Jewish people in 2,000 years. It's a pretty powerful thing. Ladies and gentlemen, the glass is not 1/16 empty, it's 15/16 full. And as you think about all these difficult situations that you face and all the challenges Israel faces, remember that our grandparents and their grandparents and their grandparents, going back 100 generations, would have given anything to trade their problems with ours. 100 generations of Jews dreamed to have the privilege that 3 generations of us have. The privilege to live at a time when there is a sovereign Jewish state. And with that privilege comes a great responsibility. And that is to ensure that privilege continues for future generations. And that responsibility does not just fall on the shoulders of a prime minister or an ambassador. It falls on each and every one of you. And the way that you fulfill that responsibility is by strengthening your own community. By strengthening here, right in Memphis, your community. By investing in your schools. By investing in your city. By ensuring that you are connected with Israel, that you are engaged with Israel. And all of you coming here tonight are doing exactly what you have to be doing by staying connected to Israel. The Rav said earlier about our name, Israel, about overcoming. Look, we face great challenges, but we have overcome much greater challenges. And I have no doubt that if we stand together, if we stand united, if communities like this one continue to invest, continue to strengthen their ties with Israel, I have no doubt that we will continue to overcome any challenge that comes our way. Thank you very much.